Okay,
quickly.
so just the last question. Just give us a sketch of how this ornamification of news for a global audience. I don't know what would be the equivalent term of that. Fox News would take offense to be related to Ornav, but how did this happen? So just very quickly.
Well, look, there's not much to say about it, but there's several, I think, parallel features here. One is, as you privatized news and news became more concerned about money than anything, of course it had to be concerned about money. It was privatized, and it became a commodity. Um, it became clear that, and I understand this, and I think it's correct, that you need to have anchors that you can identify with. This was there also before the commodification of news. When Doordarshan had its news, you had anchors. The anchors have to have a certain reliability. We all knew the names of the anchors. The English news, Hindi news, you knew who they were. They became iconic and so on. There is that. Nobody wants the news just from a robot. They want the person to be reliable. And I think there's something there. But with the commodification of news, two parallel things came together. One was this idea of the reliability of the person, and the second was entertainment. um, you had to not only be reliable, but you had to be entertaining, because you had to draw an audience in order for your TRP, your numbers to be up. If your TRPs were up, you got more advertising revenue and so on, and you got more investment. If you got more advertising, you could get more investment. So it all came down to TRP, which is basically an entertainment factor. So you had to do two things. You had to be, on the one side, a reliable anchor. That's, I think, a basic human instinct. We only listen to people we think are credible or reliable. If you're a nutcase and you say things that are crazy, you lose your credibility. So that's important to try to maintain. And I think that's part of it. But related to that is entertainment. Okay. Put the two things together. Wow. Wow. And that's Arnab. Because you see, I remember I used to, when I started, I worked for NDTV. There were a lot of young people there then. Rajdeep Sardesai, Arnab Goswami, and others. Arnab Goswami used to walk around with a copy of his book on terrorism in Assam, which he had written. He was the in-house intellectual, the only one with a book. And this is as a very young man. He grew up in Assam, and his real anti-Muslim thing comes from his life in Assam. And you see, the wave that he rode in India particularly was that he was an opportunist. The rise of Hindutva, in a way, actually produces Arnab. Arnab doesn't produce Hindutva. He is a product of the social force. So all the kind of right-wing stuff he said on TV essentially was mirroring what the government was saying or what the right wing was saying. So Arnab is not an innovator. He's a boring fellow, but he mirrored the social features. You actually don't have to be of the right to be an Arnab. You can be somebody from the center to be an Arnab. It's not necessary that you have to be on the right. It's just that in India, because of the rightward shift in this period, the Arnabs would have to be of the right. It would have been hard to have a centrist Arnab. You got a left of center Ravish, but Ravish is not Arnab. Ravish is ironic. He is factual. He's surrealistic sometimes, but he's not absurd. The absurdity, which is what I think you're referring to, is the Arnabification, is the absurdity. And it's the same in the United States. The rise of the Republicans produces Fox News, and they feed off each other. It becomes a circle that feeds off each other. So these are two examples we have. But in other countries, you don't really have the same sort of characters produced. I've asked friends in Poland and in so on, do you have like Arnabs? You have one or two characters, but they're not exactly like that. And it might have to do with it being an actually more conservative society. You see, Indian conservatism is interesting, particularly middle class conservatism. Middle class conservatism is not against the father of the family, for instance, or the mother, actually, for that matter, yelling at a poor person. It's not against that. You can go into a bazaar and see a man or a woman, middle class person, yelling at a poor person. And that's not seen as shameful. That's just seen as the class right. Arnab, in fact, just does that on TV. He does that sort of bazari yelling that the middle class person does. You'll see it on a train. A beggar enters the train, a human being who's begging, and they say, "Ah, that attitude of virulent hatred of the working class, of the poor. That attitude is acceptable in Indian conservatism. It's not acceptable in other conservatisms, like in places like Poland and so on. The yoke of Catholicism, it may not allow that kind of yelling and screaming. So there's something particular about Arnab. Arnab is the middle class man who is essentially kicking the poor off the train, yelling at the TT because the TT did something, yelling at the person because the tea is cold. That sort of license to yell at your class inferiors, as it were. You're yelling at the servants. Okay, that culture produces an Arnab. Arnab is not producing that culture. He is a product. He is a cliche of the Indian middle class.